whilst you have consultants, you can have advisors, you can have friends, you can have each other advise you a certain direction, you don't always listen. And again, that's a very real thing. As human beings, whether they're relationship issues, whether they are personal issues, whatever they are, you don't always listen. So sometimes I think one of the biggest, if you want to say, learning curves is that the whole entrepreneurial journey, and from startup right through scaling up, actually is an incredibly transformational experience. One of the things that we have realized that it's almost part of, for those who don't know, and probably you can look that up, there's a particular work of literature called Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And the hero's journey is largely what Mr. Lucas used as a model for his Star Wars saga. And essentially, the hero's journey is very much the entrepreneur's journey, because there's a level of immaturity, there's a level of coming of age, and also growing up, and there's also a profound transformation that happens to the kind of upstart along the whole journey. And one of the things that kind of I'm very passionate about and I speak about is that the whole transformation that the person experiences along the way, it's actually quite alchemical and quite changes and transforms the person's soul. And sorry to use a metaphysical term like the soul, it is part of our culture and part of our movies and kind of general speak, but it does, it's kind of, the whole journey is actually like a crucible, and it kind of transforms the soul, and there are things that it purifies it, there are things that it can taint it. For example, again, it's a very human journey. You have family, you have friends, enterprises between friends, associates, colleagues, and then you throw a good amount of money, okay, into the venture. There's a pot of gold there. And everyone has different interpretations about how that pot of gold should be spent, how it should be reaped, how it should be drawn down, and what people's level of entitlement are to that pot of gold. Money, we all know through our own kind of experiences, can change people, but it also can reveal people. Again, it's a very human thing. Companies don't just collapse. Companies are made of businesses. They're made of businesses that are made of people, and people are flawed. So a lot of human flaws, but also human strengths come through the company and come through the business. And I think the human element is often underplayed. You don't just have a whole system collapse in 2008. It was a system that actually was populated by a certain type of personality, a certain type of people that essentially exacerbated and exaggerated certain flaws. With regards to tech kind of businesses, what we've experienced as businesses, consultants, advisors, service providers, when you're dealing with a tech company, there are certain kind of personalities that make up those kind of tech companies, and you'll find their pathologies as well as their strengths are around the kind of people that go into that sector. Same thing with accounting, same thing with lawyers. So I think for me, what I found was it really is a drama, it really is a story that's played out by people, and it's driven as well as it's undermined, and it's also, if you want to say, propelled by the human factors. People play a huge role. Sometimes there are heroes, but those heroes have tragic flaws. Sometimes there are villains that turn out to be not villains, but in fact they can be saviors. Sometimes it's the CFO that actually has a strong backbone and stands up to the board or stands up to the CEO and says, we're not heading in a good direction if we keep going down that path. And I think one of the biggest concerns that I have with my journey is that having gone through the whole from the last 25 years, I wish at uni, but also wish that I had a probably a much stronger financial literacy. I think money, actually I believe and I've seen, money does go the world, money does make the world go around, and essentially it's not that hard for a business to run out of cash. And I think one of the biggest issues is that when you're looking at business, business relies on cash, and cash is different to profit. So you can have a profitable business that can run out of cash. One of the things that I realized, and we had our accountant tell us very early on, is that we were quite profitable, but the way we were deploying cash and the way we actually had our mind and our eye on the cash flow of the business, we nearly hit the wall early on, 5-7 years on. And that's because financial literacy and also fiscal kind of acumen is very critical to a business at every stage. And the bigger you get, the harder you fall. And the bigger you get, the problem is that you think that that guy whose job is to look at the money, he's looking at the money the way it should be looking at the money. But sometimes the whole thing is that everyone thinks that the other person's looking at the money and they're not. And then no one's really looking at the money and everyone's kind of got their eye everywhere else. So money and cash flow is king. When it comes to scaling and startups, people often underestimate the fiscal, the financial, the nuts and bolts, the nitty-gritty elements of an enterprise. And I think from what I've seen, and when I say from what I've seen, a large part of our businesses, actually we supply to stockists, like pharmacies, salons, and over the years, I've seen a number of our small business clients collapse. And when I see the ones that have collapsed, you notice a very common theme is that there was just an overly emphasized passion on the product, on the customer, or necessarily on the mission, the purpose of why they existed, but they forgot about the back office nuts and bolts of the business. And that is quite critical. And it's probably more critical than, if you want to say, because it's the boring stuff, but it's actually the boring stuff. The devil is in the detail, both financially, also operationally, and it can undermine your customer service, it can undermine a whole heap of things, and your whole dream, your whole passion can very quickly unravel. I say this not from a theoretical point of view, I'm telling you this from every single curveball, from every single kind of dip in the slide that I've gone through over the last, if you want to say 25 years. What has kind of really struck out at me is that I think, to be quite honest, we came out of uni and we had never run a $100 million business before. We had never run a $50 million business before. I mean, we grew up from small business. Our parents were small business shopkeeper operators. As the business was scaling, one of the things that we thought we were doing right was bringing consultants like the PwCs, like the various consultants that supposedly run or help and advise governments and big business. But the problem with those kind of big, if you want to say, suits end of town, is that they actually haven't themselves taken businesses and scaled them from 5 million to 10 million to 50 to 100. They only advise businesses that are already around 100 million or 500 million or billion, okay? So even though we thought we were paying really good money for advice of where people are at that stratosphere of success, they weren't still in the position to assist us on scaling. Scaling is one of the most difficult aspects of any enterprise. And whether you scale from $1 million to 5 to 10, 10 to 20, it's still scaling. And again, being very human, family business, we had never taken it. And there's a lot of kind of flying by the seat of your pants. And there's a lot of really kind of living by your wits. And people who claim to have answers don't really have answers. Okay, there's a lot of snake oil salespeople that actually profess to know things, and they claim to know things, and they come into business as consultants. I'm not vilifying consultants overall, and I think it gets worse at the big end of town. It gets much worse at the big end of town. For those who haven't read recently, the big four accounting firms were classifying themselves as SMEs to get government contracts. Hilarious. Okay, so that was kind of cutting, small businesses' lunch very openly and quite ruthlessly. So The biggest area that I have noticed that in the past, and as of late recently, is the disruption that we've experienced with the whole digital economy. The whole digital economy, in terms of social media, technology, completely overall computer technology, has been the single most disruptive force that I think any business owner, no matter how old they are, 20-year-old, 80-year-old, 60-year-old, have ever experienced. And the thing is this, it's still the Wild West. So if you were to take, for example, building a website, which has been a very interesting experience as a brand our size, you have web designers that design but don't develop. Then you have developers that are developers but don't design, and then you kind of, it's a whole mishmash. It really is. If you are to watch a Wild West Western back in the 50s and 60s, that's what the tech industry is like still. Because it's, and not to do kind of disclaim it, but it's still quite new. So it hasn't really probably gained shape. Probably the most, if you want to say, similar situation is what was happening with steel and oil in early last century. It was an industry that was like you had monopolistic giants taking over different things, and it was unregulated. And right now, European regulators and American regulators are only starting to talk about what to do with the likes of the Google, Facebooks, that essentially control data, have completely fragmented and changed the face of media. So these are the kind of disruptions that I'm dealing with as a business, that a lot of us have been dealing with, and there are no answers. I think one of the most pertinent skills you can develop as an entrepreneur is to find your own answers, but most importantly is to ask, get really good at asking the right questions, and questions that help you solve your problems and identify problems or identify opportunities. I think that's been the most critical skill set as an entrepreneur that has not been at the helm before of a hundreds of millions of dollars worth of company. And I think when you have executives that have gone up these corporations, banks, whether they're big conglomerates, they've risen through an architecture that already is at the $500 million to $1 billion. So they've learned to manage a $500 million to $1 billion business. And even if they come and they start their own business, it's a completely different ball game to start them from zero and take it to $100 million, even though they've been busy managing it at that high stratosphere. So scale is a very complex thing, a lot more complex than entrepreneurs probably realize or give credit to. Also businesses give credit to. We found that the most kind of challenging, if you want to say, because people who profess to know the answers don't really know the answers, and we get better with time as we kind of progress and we become more experienced at asking the right questions and seeking the right answers. The other thing also is from a perspective of globalization. Our global experience from taking the brand from Australian shores to America was probably one of the most eye-opening and mind-broadening experience. The brand achieved a level of fame and success in the USA that very few brands have to this day. Like, it started off with a contract with Saks Fifth Avenue, which in retail land is like landing kind of in El Dorado, and then you land a contract with, if you say Target. Target was it's one of the, it's after Walmart, it's the next biggest retailer. You then end up, after 10 years of kind of schlepping it out there and really beating the path with the likes of a Nordstrom, Neiman Marcus, and you think you've arrived, but if you're looking at just the top line revenue, and if you're just looking at the shadow that the brand casts, you can quickly fool yourself and delude yourself that you're doing well, and you probably are from a perspective of PR, but to achieve that level of footprint, it was very costly, and it nearly broke the back of the Australian business that was supporting that growth. And there is nobody. I mean, Country Road came back from the US and pulled out. Peter Alexander, a whole heap of other brands. The US is a very difficult market to crack. We found it extraordinarily difficult to maintain hold of. Whenever you're expanding overseas, and this is just in retail, But whenever you're expanding into a new territory, there are so many nuances that you can't predict, and very few people can honestly tell you about and show you or help you or tell you how to overcome them or how to deal with them. So I think with scale and overseas expansion, it can be a very difficult thing. If I was to say to you, well then what's your advice? My advice is take it slowly. Be very, very careful how much you bite off, because what you're chewing, you don't really know what you're chewing, okay? And often takes you a while to chew, a lot longer than what you thought it would take you a while. Like, take California. California is almost a whole country in itself. And it's a very different economy, society, culture, overall infrastructure to say Texas or New York. And just probably conquering California alone can be a lifetime task. And trying to expand too quickly for the sake of the brand's kind of, if you want to say, reputation or credibility, can actually be quite punishing on the cash flow and quite punishing on the P&L. So I think, getting back to my original point, you can't ever take your eye off the cash flow, ever. It is what guides every business, no matter how fancy, how tech-oriented, how great a brand, how sophisticated a technology. It is like the blood in your body. If something happens in the blood, it's like all organs shut down, it's finished, game over. The P&L needs to guide decisions. It's not the be-all end-all, but you do always have to take and make sensible decisions. And I think, as a business, if you were to say what I would have done differently if I rewrote the story and relived it, is probably be a lot more fiscally oriented, with not just knowing my numbers, but really, I won't say short of worshipping them, but really almost calibrating everything that I do with my numbers. Now, you can get a little bit overly mechanistic and quite rigid, so you have to be careful you don't kill the entrepreneurial spirit that runs through the brand and animates the brand and the product and the organizational culture. But it doesn't take long, and it doesn't take much to actually bring a business to its knees if it's not got its eye on the money. And I know that sounds a little bit boring and not as fanciful, but the whole issue of scaling, the whole issue of expansion and bringing something to market, at the end of the day, it requires, and to keep it going and keep it growing, it requires money. It requires really smart, sensible of money, and it requires all the business. I think one of the things that is dangerous is when you have types, the creative type, the ops type, the this type, not having their eye on the P&L and not knowing their numbers. First of all, from a legal perspective, every director has to know and has to be aware. Saying that I don't know, it's not my job, isn't an excuse under the eyes of the law. So everybody has to have their eyes on the numbers. Second thing is that the entrepreneurial spirit of the business has to be protected at all times, because you can have the bean counters choke the essence and the spirit of the business, the culture of the business. So it is a really fine balance. And again, we're talking about, it's very human problems. You know, if you've got a very strong creative personality that's driving the business, and the financial personality is good and capable, it isn't strong enough to stand up to the creative personality, you can have dynamics that are actually quite dangerous. And you can, vice versa, the other way. So everything rests on making sure that you don't just look at the business mechanics, but you also look at the human mechanics between personalities that play within the business. And because we're talking about startups, the germ of an idea, the seed of an idea, can be quite intoxicating, and you can kind of, especially when you have youth on your side and a little bit of experience, you can do anything and you can do everything. That's great, and I think you can't underestimate the role that youth plays in energy that drives a business, but you also can't underestimate the role that experience has to direct that youthful energy. And I think having a good play of, if you want to say, vitalities in a business is quite strong. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes if you're starting off quite, in a mature kind of age, having younger people around you to help drive the dynamism, or the opposite, if you're starting off quite young, bringing in some more mature energy to help have that wisdom drive that energy and focus it and channel it, is actually a really quite useful experience. Because we started quite young, we all started in our early 20s and mid-20s, and by 5 to 10 years in, when we're actually expanding to the States, the average age of the business was about 29 to 30 years old. That's really young. That is really young, and there were things that we could have seen better and should have seen better, but we didn't, because we didn't have that level of experience and that level of maturity in the mix of the culture driving the business. So again, very, very human kind of reality that startups and enterprises are. I think to kind of wrap this up, because I don't want to kind of infinitely talk, how are we going for time?
Yeah, a couple more minutes would be great, and then we can open it up.
I've always had kind of the model, as I said to you, that it is a hero's journey. The entrepreneurial journey actually has an alchemic effect on your soul. You grow, but not everybody grows. So there are people who kind of knocks and scrapes and scratches can either harden them and make them bitter, or it can make you better. And I think, again, it comes down to how you decipher experience, how you process experience, and whether you use that experience to actually grow as a person, or it actually stalls you, it stagnates you, it makes you kind of untrusting or overly trusting, or there are dysfunctions of personality. And I think with regards to overall that alchemical journey, it's very easy to start off like at a mythical knight level. You reach up to prince, you become a king, but kings can still be overthrown. There are brands, there are businesses that at the height of their glory, kind of they got overthrown. And they were backed by good and big money. I mean, the likes, if you look at the whole Packer enterprise joint with the Murdoch with OneTel, that was quite, how do you explain that? You can't just explain that they were too interested in feng shui. There are pathologies that kind of drive a business and either drive it up and to success or can drive it to the ground. So again, I just think we need to keep in mind that enterprise, business, startup is very real, it's very human. We have to address the human elements of it as well as the business elements. Cash flow is everything. You have to always keep your eye on the numbers. The numbers drive everything. They affect scale, they affect expansion, and at the same token, we have to offset that, I want to say, governance with making sure that we don't drown out the entrepreneurial spirit. The entrepreneurial spirit does help animate and does help invigorate a brand and drive its growth and drive overall its direction in terms of future. So that's kind of what I wanted to just share with you in terms of my treasure chest. I want to speak to you. There's a lot. I mean, some of the anecdotes I told you in terms of the US or kind of starting a business with scale, it is such a rich experience. It's on par with being in a partnership, it's on par with being a parent. It is a very rich experience. It's one of those experiences that you're grateful that you suffered, whether you win, you lose, or you're against the ropes. You are grateful that you suffered it because you learned so much and grew so much. But at the same token, it's a very difficult experience to predict what you're going to get out of it and what you're going to come out of it with. So, hand on heart, that's kind of an honest account of how I've seen and how we've experienced the entrepreneurial journey. Disruption is something that is a curveball you should always expect. It's hard to predict, it's hard to prepare for. You have to kind of do your best to see it on the horizon and not dig your heels in, or not necessarily get overly, embracive of it, because change, for the love of change, can also disrupt. And that's kind of just on my end what I want to share with you today. My passion with sharing these stories is really about my belief that entrepreneurial spirit and entrepreneurialism is the channel and the way that we can help solve our problems, because well-meaning, creative enterprises that are driven by profit and driven by the need and the drive to change the world and have a meaning as an entrepreneur is really important. Sometimes stagnant or stale or lifeless or corrupt governments and institutions can't drive the change that we need soon enough in society. And for me, sharing my experience helps. Maybe it's something, it's a nugget, it's 2 or 3 that people can take away and be available for people to kind of ask. And that's it, that's me today. Thank you very much.
Anyone got any questions? Fiona.
So, Emanuel, thank you very much for being coming. For any new businesses thinking of starting up, I think you've given a huge amount of information there, and they could grasp those key golden nuggets to get going, because that's the way it is, that's the way it turns out, and you can't forget that human aspect. And I love the Joseph Campbell references to hero's journey, so that's really refreshing. I really enjoyed that. Can I ask you why you chose the US market to expand into, and not something a little bit more manageable? And when you were doing that, did you, it sounds to me from what you were saying that you self-funded, or did you get investors? Because investors like a certain language, which is the numbers that you're talking about. They don't necessarily want to hear anything about a well-meaning business that wants to change the world through, you know, their humanness. So can you talk a little bit?
Yeah, look, self-funded it completely. We withdrew from the market because the GFC was an unexpected blow. And I'll give you an example. Your typical footprint in a retail department store went from, say, $550 per square meter down to about $260 to $250 per square meter. So even though you had footprint, you had distribution points, the yield dramatically dropped. And this was from 2008, and America didn't start becoming functional for at least 2011, 2012, where just that level of panic and that level of just drying up kind of started disappearing, and you started seeing liquidity come back into the market. So it hampered us. We were fortunate that the Australian operation did not experience, because I don't know if I would be here standing to tell you the story, and I don't know if Australia would have survived the whole rational situation should Australia have experienced what America experienced, first and foremost. And that's a reality. I think we often underplay the role that luck plays in business. I mean, luck, whether you believe in it, her, or whatever it is a major factor. And Napoleon Bonaparte always used to say, I'd rather have a lucky general than a smarter general. Because he knew, and he was very well aware that fortune would play. So for me, we chose the US because it is the largest reference market as a brand in the beauty cosmetics industry. The Hollywood factor and how it references itself and is referred to and is aspired to by Asia, by Europe, and the whole world was quite important. So we felt that the US, as opposed to where a lot of Australians go to, the UK, was more significant. In other words, if there was an Asian player, if that, you know, that was interested in the brand from a distribution point of view, seeing the brand in, you know, I've got a mind blank right now. There's a particular one store, Burger Goodman. Okay, so for those who don't know, Scatter My Ashes and Burger Goodman is a classic kind of TV show that talks about the aspirational quality that Burger Goodman has. We actually made it into Burger. We actually were picked as a makeup brand. We had our own counter there. So when it comes to having achieved the pinnacle of retail representation in America, we achieved it, but we weren't making the money. We weren't liquid. We weren't really profitable. It was breaking our back. We were self-funding it. It was breaking us in terms of resources. So scaling, whilst it seemed exciting and to the point of exhilaration, that exhilaration can lead you to fly. You think you can fly or fly too close to the sun and your wings melt. Yet you've got to really, really be careful. And I use There's a reason why mythical metaphors still have reference, because it's very real. That's a reality. You can soar too high too soon, and you can ignore good advice that people tell you, but you're just, either it's youth, your stubbornness, your personality, your aspirations. Again, it's a very, very human experience. So we did self-fund it, that's why we chose it, and that's what he did to us. And to be quite honest with you, it rendered us and has rendered us anemic as a business over the last 3 to 4 years. And we are only now starting to come out of that in terms of the US, what it did to the business financially, fiscally, operationally. Because when you have, like the human body, when you have all this blood rush to a certain area, you know what happens to the rest of the body. It takes a while for the blood to flow back and actually reanimate, reinvigorate the rest of the body organs. So for us, the Australian operation carried, shouldered, burdened the whole thing. And the Australian operation said, like, okay, that's nice, it's good that you're there, but come back home. And we exited very cleanly. Like, we just said, look, we can't be here anymore. There were we still have openings, we still have e-commerce connections there and trading relationship, but it was just one of those decisions we had to take. It had to be we weren't prepared for it to be our Waterloo moment. We didn't want it, didn't need to be our Waterloo moment. It was best that we say, okay, we're out of here, we'll come back, we know how to do it, we know how we did it, and we know what not to do. So when the time comes and we go back, it'll be just a very different, more experienced, more wiser venture. Does that make sense? Yeah, great. Any other questions? Yep, go for it.
You spoke of starting a family business.
Yes.
Can you talk to your management structure as it presently exists? Do you have board? Do you have independent directors? The roles that you each hold within the company now?
Yeah, sure. So Napoleon is the largest shareholder himself. His wife Marie and myself are equal shareholders, so we're the 3 directors. We have a 4th NED, non-executive director. That's our board level. We then have a key manager level, which key managers act as a board of advisors and often are brought into board meetings to discuss non-confidential matters. Look, I wouldn't call it pathological, but I wouldn't call it necessarily best governance functionality. I think family dynamics, and I know, and I've seen this and I've heard it from a number of other fellow business owners that are family businesses, I think decisions can be very easily rendered intuitive, and the numbers, the empiricism, personalities play a role. And I think as time has come, you know, myself, Marie, the other boards probably have, because Napoleon as a personality, if you haven't met him on the screen, he is a very big personality, he's a very driven personality, and the sense when you get is that, you know, when you have a strong CEO, whether it's a Martin Keynes and David Jones, or whether it's kind of Solomon Lew, whatever it is, you have strong kind of personalities, you need a strong board to counter that and say, oh, hang on a second, that's a great idea, but here and here and here and here. And you can have a number of different scenarios where there's conflict that emerges, or you have acquiescence. You may not have a strong direction taken from a contrarian point of view that probably in hindsight would have proven to be long-term better. So I think the family businesses, look, you have healthy families, you have happy families, and as, what's his name, Tolstoy said, all unhappy families, all happy families are alike. It's the unhappy ones that are not. So I think there's no perfect family. There's no such thing as a Brady Bunch board. It's like, you just don't get it. You'll always have different things. But I think what has helped us is sticking true to where our sales and where our interests lie, and having voices, as long as there's always a voice of reason and there's a respected voice of reason on any board, whether it's a family member or not a family member, that reminds the board of its interests, that how they're aligned, and where their sales should at least, from a, if you want to say a latitude or kind of gradient kind of line, I think that is actually a very grounding and a very stabilizing effect. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's
cool.
You've made some comments with regard to consultants.
Yes.
Are you still bringing them in, or you're now more informed in terms of how you engage with them, or are you still bringing them in?
with great trepidation. Yes, I am. And I'll give you an example. Like, you're dealing with funding and financing, which is, let me just tell you something about banks. When you don't need their money, they're there begging you and loving you. When you need their money, they're there literally with a whip and ready to crucify you. So sometimes when they're at that appetite where they don't really want to have you, sometimes you need to bring the likes of the big wigs to kind of credibility, legitimize your story and your proposal and your figures. That's probably where I found the most useful, but with experience, what helps is that you narrow their scope and you focus their scope, and it's really understanding that they're there to serve your interests. And sometimes there's a level of haughtiness, especially the bigger the brand that they're coming with, and you really need to not cut them down to size, but say, look, at the end of the day, I'm hiring you, it's not the bank, not them, you need to do this, let's move on to it, and keeping them on task. I think they can very easily stray on tangents to secure themselves bigger income streams and future jobs. So I do bring them on, great trepidation, fewer times, but with a lot more narrowed scopes, almost not in handcuffs, but tied up and bound a lot more time. And that's been with experience. Yeah, does that make sense?
It does. Can I say one more?
Sure, go for it.
In terms of your...
This is my favourite part. If I could start every session with a Q&A, I would, because I just think it's more interesting, because the audience kind of gets what they need.
Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with your range.
That's right.
Or your distribution.
Please, go for it.
The next step for the company, so you've withdrawn from the US,
Yeah.
but at least you've established the brand's name internationally.
Yes.
And therefore you can roll across Asia, or you can
Yes.
roll across. So are you not making whitening cream for the Asian market or whatever?
Not yet.
Okay. Well, I wasn't sure in terms of how you would change your product, and how you would expand, and how you would change your product range.
Look, it's quite serendipitous because I am in the process of discussing with and securing some Asian distribution. And one of the things that kind of, obviously they asked was very interesting. Our range is very yellow based, so the range, even our foundations, which is the makeup that the ladies put on for as a product, to put the rest of the makeup on, is essentially yellow based. A lot of foundations pre-95-90 were very pink and beige based, so there's been a movement, and in Australia we pioneered a lot of that movement with regards to products and all that. Obviously now the product and the market has become a lot more fiercely competitive, and yes, you do need to customise to a certain market, but it depends on what you want to go for as well. I mean, there aren't that many personality brands as such, and I would term Microsoft before Bill Gates leaving as a personality brand, even though it was Microsoft, it was Bill Gates. So Napoleon's very much like that as in the makeup market. I think with overseas markets and just generally when you're expanding your brand, I think as a brand you just have to be always mindful of your DNA and realize that, almost like he mentioned bioinformation, in terms of epigenetics, you can morph your genes, you can change your genes, and you can change your DNA with the decisions you take and experiences you undertake. So for us, we're in the process of digitizing our genes. So we've always been a bricks and mortar retailer. So we're becoming more and more digital, and it's a reality that I'm experiencing firsthand and realizing what a cowboy land Wild West it is. And that's kind of, I'm in the thick of it right now. Like, there's a lot that's still not being, decided. Facebook's changing its algorithm. So marketing on Facebook is going to change again, and it's just Google the same thing with regards to in-stream, big bumper ads. Like, all that is so fresh and scary, but it's also invigorating. And I think we just need to you have to approach them with a healthy skepticism and a very open, adaptable, agile, and nimble mind. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yes?
How do you manage, so you went over to America and said you did go to Asia, do you have a whole separate team out there on the ground? Or do you...
In the US, did we?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We set it up as a branch system. It was like a branch. So we set up a whole operation in the US. Would I do that again? Is that what you're asking me?
Well, if you went to Asia, and how, because yeah, the sort of nuances of going to a different country and the things. So I'm looking at going to the UK, but with my sister who lives there.
Yeah.
So we sort of have one each there, but you know, whether we would have our own teams separately eventually, or it's also managed from one hub, and you try and apply the same rules, I suppose.
I want to bring you back to something that I said earlier. It's not about the answers, it's about the questions you ask.
Yeah.
Meaning that if you have a particular idea, like, for example, you're set to a certain degree on a branch model, like she's being there, you being here, you got to ask yourself, why is that necessarily so? Why should it be that way? How else could it be? Is that going to work for me? I think when people profess to tell you and know the answers, I think you should be dealing with people who ask you questions that challenge you and ask you questions that really excite you but also scare you. And I remember one of the things that I kind of tell you is that I love, one of my favorite quotes from Muhammad Ali is that if your dreams don't scare you, they're just not big enough. So I think there's a level of exhilaration and fear that if questions don't invoke that, then you're not getting to the soul and the root of the issue. And I wouldn't go down the branch model again with the US. I just wouldn't do that. It's too big a market. It's too disparate. It's too huge. It's too heterogeneous. And even though we're Anglophonic, then we're not, in a sense. Even their English is different. Their way they speak, their mindset. So be careful. I know you sound like you have a slight English accent.
Yeah.
Right. So assuming there's a lot, and there's probably a lot more similarity between Australia and Britain, the UK, than there is between the US and Australia. But it's still, they're different markets, and you just have to really be careful, and you have to just constantly scrutinize and challenge everything. Like, I'm not saying be cynical, but move more and more towards a skeptical mindset, whilst not becoming rigid and cynical. Guard against cynicism, because it does rob you and deprive you of the pleasure and the joy of your enterprise. Any other questions?
That's a question about that. It sounds a glib question. The UK, 4 degrees. Northern Territory, 40 degrees, was high humidity. So therefore, you end up having to tailor your products for a local environment in any way?
Not your product, your assortment.
Okay.
So you may not necessarily need to ship your whole makeup foundation or your whole makeup range up there. You may need to only have a smaller store and ship a third or 2/3 of your range there. So you would adjust your assortment accordingly, like they do in fashion. And you may need to come up with some new product, right? Because there's also trends, like at the moment, not at the moment, 3-4 years ago, but like setting spray for girls, setting their makeup. That was all the rage. And when we had it prematurely, it wasn't the rage yet, so we discontinued it. So trends are still a bet. They're still a gamble. You can't always predict them. You're not always going to jump on them. But you do need to be aware that there is customization, yes, without a doubt.
Following up on what we talked about skepticism and fear in making decisions, and before we were talking about the dichotomy between youth and experience.
Yes.
How do you, when you're young, obviously you're naive, so that gives you a bit of drive, but how do you decide, how do you get the confidence to make a choice? Obviously there'll be people in the business that have more experience and can give you some guidance, but you're still driving it at the end of the day. So if you are young and you're starting a business, where does that confidence come from?
Where does that confidence come from? In truth, hubris, and it does inoculate. You can't, okay, I want to answer really brutally honest. You're not going to be able to ever prevent yourself from making mistakes. And there are certain mistakes you just have to make. But there are certain mistakes you don't need to make. And I'm sorry, I don't have the answer which is which. I think a good way to inoculate yourself from not making unnecessary or stupid mistakes is to seek counsel, not consultants, seek counsel from not a variety of people, because then you can have paralysis analysis as well. You don't want to avoid that. But you do want to seek counsel from people that have possibly done it, and also have a motive that they care for you and that they don't want to see you, you do have to weigh up their skepticism or their hesitation, okay? And you do sometimes have to put the chips on youth, because even if they come against you and the winds come your way, if you have a strong enough engine, you can survive the headwinds. Sometimes it is just about surviving and flying through the headwinds. Sometimes it does come down to sheer tenacity and resilience to endure a situation and triumph with a situation. And unfortunately, I don't think anybody has a crystal ball that will ever tell you that. As I said to you, the only thing I can tell you is be very careful, understand that you have a level of youth and energy, but you also lack the wisdom and experience. Seek it out as often and as much as you can, listen to it, really weigh it up, and then take a decision accordingly. And I think that's my biggest thing was I probably didn't seek it out from the right people and enough times.